40,000 kilometers of roads, relay stations, and frontier garrisons. That is roughly what the Han administrative system had to coordinate at its peak. Not just territory, but time itself stretched across it. And yet, what it built to connect the empire is exactly what made it brittle when pressure started to rise. The expectation was simple. Messages would move from Chang'an to the edges of the empire, taxes would return, orders would be executed, and the system would remain in sync. That assumption held long enough to create one of the most integrated pre-modern states in history. But it didn't hold forever. By the late Western Han period, around the 1st century BCE, reports from frontier commanderies like Dunhuang and Hershi were already arriving late enough that they described situations that had changed before the central court could respond. That delay, sometimes measured in weeks for urgent military intelligence, wasn't seen as catastrophic at first. It was treated as normal friction. It wasn't. Because what the Han Dynasty built wasn't just territorial expansion. It was a communication architecture layered over geography that did not cooperate with imperial speed. This is where the Silk Road enters the picture, though not as a romantic trade corridor, more as a logistical compromise. Silk Road wasn't designed as a single system. It was a chain of local exchanges stitched together by necessity. Each segment worked. The full chain barely did, and the Han state relied on it anyway, for horses from the Fergana Valley, for intelligence from Central Asia, for revenue flowing through intermediary kingdoms it did not fully control. That dependency created something subtle. The empire was expanding its reach, but losing precision at the edges. There's a record from the Han court archives describing how frontier officials increasingly had to interpret intent rather than execute direct orders. That phrase matters more than it looks. Interpretation replaces instruction when instruction arrives too late to be useful. And once that begins, central authority doesn't disappear. It degrades. The system still looks intact on maps, but internally it is already asynchronous. You can see the strain most clearly in the logistics of grain transport. Moving supplies from the Yellow River Basin to frontier garrisons required coordinated scheduling across river transport, road caravans, and storage depots. One disrupted node, a flooded section, a delayed convoy, a misreported inventory, didn't just cause local shortages, it multiplied across the chain. The Han bureaucracy had accounting methods sophisticated enough to track these flows in detail. What it lacked was speed. And speed in a distributed empire is not a luxury. It is the difference between correction and collapse. There is a quiet irony here. The more the Han expanded, the more data it generated, and the harder it became for that data to remain current enough to govern anything. Which raises a question that will matter more as this unfolds. What happens when an empire is still receiving information about a world that has already moved on? We'll return to that, because the answer is not only in war or rebellion or even corruption. It is in the structure of connection itself. A courier leaving Luoyang in the early 2nd century would not see the empire as fragile. He would see the opposite. Standardized roads, relay stations spaced at regulated intervals, command posts that still responded with stamped authority seals from the capital. From the inside, the Han still looked synchronized. But synchronization and real-time control are not the same thing. And that gap is where systems begin to fail without looking like they are failing. By the time messages reached frontier commanderies in the northwest, especially around Hershi Corridor, conditions on the ground had already shifted. Nomadic pressure from the Xiongnu confederations wasn't static. It moved seasonally, fragmented, reformed under new leadership structures that the Han administrative model struggled to track in real time. So the empire adapted in a very specific way. It delegated. Not formally, not cleanly, but operationally. Local military governors and commandery officials began making decisions that the central court would only review after the fact. On paper, this was still obedience. In practice, it was autonomy with delayed auditing. And delayed auditing is a quiet form of decentralization. One preserved document from the Eastern Han period shows a frontier official requesting confirmation for troop movement orders that had already been executed 2 months earlier. The reply from the capital arrives with procedural corrections, but no operational relevance. The system was still speaking. It was just no longer steering. At the same time, the economic backbone of the empire was being stretched across that same geography. Silk production in the Yangtze Basin, salt monopolies in the east, grain taxation in the north, all of it funneled through administrative channels that assumed stable timing. But timing had become variable. This matters more than it sounds. In centralized agrarian empires, tax collection is not just revenue. It is synchronization. It tells the state what exists, where it exists, and what can be mobilized. When that synchronization slows, the state does not immediately weaken. It becomes uncertain. And uncertainty spreads faster than rebellion. The Silk Road again plays a structural role here, not as a cause of collapse, but as a pressure multiplier. Trade along Silk Road introduced wealth flows that were partially outside direct imperial accounting. That meant local elites in corridor regions, especially along the Hersey axis, began accumulating resources faster than the center could fully monitor or tax. Over time, that creates a second layer of authority, not officially separate, just operationally independent. There is a point in the Han administrative records where you start seeing repeated audits of the same regions, not because corruption suddenly increased, but because the first audit was no longer trusted by the time the second was compiled. That is administrative lag turning into institutional doubt. And once doubt enters the system, every delay starts to look like failure, even when nothing has technically broken yet. We should pause on one detail. The Han state never stopped functioning. It kept issuing decrees, collecting partial taxes, raising armies when necessary. But each function was now slightly out of phase with the others, like gears that still turn but no longer mesh cleanly. Which leads to the next question that the empire itself never fully answered in time. When an administrative system becomes asynchronous, what does control even mean anymore? By the early 2nd century, the Han state is still doing something that looks like control. It issues edicts. It rotates officials. It launches campaigns against frontier pressure. From the capital outward, the machinery is intact. But if you zoom in on the timing of decisions, a different pattern appears. Decisions are arriving after the conditions they were meant to govern have already shifted. That gap is not dramatic at first. It shows up in logistics reports, in delayed cavalry deployments, in grain requisitions that arrive after local surpluses have already been consumed. Small mismatches, easily explained away, until they start clustering. One of the clearest examples sits in the military administration of the northwestern frontier. Commanderies along what is now Gansu repeatedly request reinforcements for localized unrest. The court responds with approvals that are technically correct, procedurally sound, and operationally late. By the time troops arrive, the local situation has already stabilized, or escalated into something entirely different. This is where the structure of the empire matters more than any single event. Because the Han system depends on layered reporting, local to commandery, to provincial, to court, to return directive, every layer adds delay. Every delay reduces fidelity. And reduced fidelity forces local officials to improvise. Improvise long enough, and improvisation becomes governance. There is a record from the Eastern Han archives describing frontier officials maintaining temporary defensive arrangements for years at a time without formal ratification. The phrase temporary survives in the documents long after the arrangements have become permanent. That is how institutional drift works, not rupture, accumulation. At the same time, the economic structure feeding the center is also changing shape. The Silk Road is no longer just a corridor of exchange. It has become a chain of semi-autonomous nodes. Oasis states, intermediary merchants, and frontier garrisons all begin to develop localized incentives that do not always align with Chang'an's fiscal expectations. The empire still receives goods, horses, jade, glassware, military intelligence, but it does not fully control the terms under which those goods move. And control without terms is only partial sovereignty. There is a Western counterargument often raised here, that the Han didn't fail structurally, but was simply overwhelmed by external pressure from nomadic coalitions and internal court factionalism. That is not wrong, but it is incomplete, because it doesn't explain why responses to those pressures were systematically late. External threats do not automatically produce lag. Administrative architecture does. This is where the reversal begins to matter. The same system that allowed the Han to integrate a vast territory also ensured that any feedback loop inside that territory would be slow by design. The larger it grew, the more stable it looked locally, and the less responsive it became globally. Stability and responsiveness were trading places. There is a human-scale version of this that appears in a single recorded case. A county magistrate along the frontier requesting clarification on tax exemptions for relocated populations. The clarification arrives after the population has already moved again, twice. By the time policy catches up, the population is elsewhere, the tax base is elsewhere, and the administrative category is technically still pending adjustment. That word, pending, starts appearing more often in late Han documentation, not because things are unresolved, but because resolution has fallen out of sync with reality. And this leads into the deeper fracture. Once an empire becomes asynchronous, it stops collapsing in one moment. It starts dissolving in multiple timelines at once. By the early 1900s CE, the Han Empire is no longer a single decision-making organism. It is a set of partially connected decision loops, each operating on different time delays, each still using the language of central authority while behaving increasingly like independent systems. The capital at Luoyang still produces directives. Frontier regions still send reports. Tax offices still compile numbers. But the intervals between action and feedback have stretched to the point where response is no longer a single event. It is a process that may or may not still be relevant when it completes. And that changes how power behaves. A governor in the Northwest can now make a military decision in response to local pressure without waiting for approval, because waiting guarantees irrelevance. A court official in the capital can still issue a corrective edict, but by the time it arrives, the situation it addresses may have already shifted twice. This is not rebellion yet. It is something more structural, permission through delay. The center does not formally lose authority. It loses immediacy. And in pre-modern systems, immediacy is a large part of what authority actually is. Meanwhile, the fiscal structure is quietly tightening in the wrong places. Tax quotas remain formally unchanged, but collection becomes uneven. Some regions overperform to maintain favor. Others underdeliver due to instability or local capture. The result is not total collapse of revenue, it is volatility inside the revenue stream. And volatility is harder to govern than shortage. In this period, frontier commanderies along the Hersey axis and deeper into what earlier texts describe as stable administrative zones begin negotiating logistics directly with merchant networks tied to Silk Road routes. Grain, horses, military supplies, these flows increasingly bypass clean bureaucratic channels and move through hybrid arrangements between officials, traders, and local power brokers. On paper, the Han state still controls trade. In practice, it is sharing it. There is a document from this period that reads almost bureaucratically mundane, a report noting that grain allocated for a garrison did not arrive in full because part of the shipment was reallocated during transit due to urgent local requirements. No dramatic language, no admission of breakdown. Just administrative normalization of deviation. That is how systems begin to dissolve without announcing it. Now, the counter-argument matters here. Some historians argue the real cause of Han fragmentation is political. Court eunuch factions, imperial succession instability, and the resulting legitimacy crisis. And that is true at the surface level. But it still doesn't explain why local responses became faster than central ones. Political instability explains conflict. It does not explain systemic lag. The lag comes from structure, and structure is harder to repair than leadership. The reversal is this. The Han system did not collapse because it stopped functioning. It collapsed because too many parts kept functioning independently of each other. The gears still turned. They just stopped aligning. There is a moment in the late Eastern Han where regional military leaders begin retaining troops in permanent readiness status without central approval, justified under the language of border uncertainty. The central court responds with formal objections, but those objections are now informational rather than operational. Authority has become advisory. One last detail before we close this part. Some frontier reports begin arriving not late, but duplicated. Multiple versions of the same event from different administrative layers, each slightly inconsistent. When a state starts receiving conflicting versions of its own reality, it is no longer governing a territory. It is interpreting it. And interpretation is what replaces control when timing breaks down.